The late afternoon sun painted the vast Texan plains with golden hues as 9-year-old Ethan Blake raced through the wheat fields behind his family's modest home. Laughter echoed in the air as his father, Jack Blake, playfully chased him. Jack was a towering figure, both in stature and character, a man revered in their tight-knit community as a just and unwavering police officer. To young Ethan, he was more than a father. He was a hero, embodying everything the boy aspired to be. "Ethan, you've got to be faster if you want to keep up with the bad guys," Jack teased, his voice warm and steady, as he finally caught Ethan in a playful tackle. They both collapsed into the tall grass, laughing and panting. "You know," Jack said, his tone shifting to a more serious one, "justice isn't about catching the bad guys, it's about protecting the good ones. Always remember that." Ethan nodded earnestly, absorbing every word as though it were scripture. These moments with his father were more than lessons. They were seeds of a future Ethan was determined to cultivate. But fate had its own plans. One crisp autumn evening, the tranquility of their small town shattered. Jack, as dependable as the sunrise, had volunteered to patrol a strip of local businesses after reports of escalating thefts. Ethan had begged to go with him, but Jack had gently refused, tousling his son's hair. "Not this time, buddy. It's just routine." Routine became tragedy. The following morning, a deputy arrived at their doorstep, his face pale and drawn. Ethan's mother, Laura, answered, her heart instantly gripped by dread. The words that followed tore through the household like a storm. Jack had been ambushed by a group of bikers, known for their terrorizing ways. He had been outnumbered, beaten, and shot while protecting a local shop owner. The funeral was a blur to Ethan. The community turned out in droves, mourning their fallen hero, but no amount of condolences could fill the void left by Jack. Ethan stood silently by the casket, his small hand clutching his father's police badge, now cold and heavy with responsibility. That night, he sat alone in his room, staring at the stars through his window. A solemn vow formed in his young heart. He would never let evil win, not while he was still standing. Years passed, and the little boy hardened into a disciplined man. Fueled by the memory of his father, Ethan excelled academically and physically, eventually joining the military. The rigors of basic training were grueling, but Ethan thrived, rising quickly through the ranks and catching the attention of recruiters for the Special Forces. It was there that Ethan became a finely tuned weapon, a master of combat, reconnaissance, and strategy. Yet, the path of a warrior was not without scars. Ethan's unit was sent on a covert mission to dismantle a paramilitary network in South America. The intelligence was flawed, and an ambush ensued. Ethan's survival instincts kicked in, saving his own life but at a devastating cost. Several of his closest comrades fell. Their faces haunted his dreams, their screams echoing in his mind. Guilt consumed him, and though he received commendations for his bravery, Ethan saw himself as anything but a hero. A debilitating injury sustained during a later mission forced Ethan into early retirement. Stripped of the structure and purpose that had defined his adult life, he returned to civilian life in Seattle, where his uncle Charles offered him a sanctuary. Charles, a charismatic and insightful man with a knack for mechanical work, provided Ethan not only a home but also an outlet. The days spent restoring old motorcycles in Charles's garage were therapeutic. The rhythmic clinking of tools and the smell of oil replaced the cacophony of gunfire in Ethan's memories. "You can't outrun the past, Ethan," Charles would often say as they worked side by side. "But you can shape the future. It's not about what you've done, it's about what you'll do next." Despite Charles's wisdom, Ethan found himself grappling with an unrelenting emptiness. The justice system that had failed his father still festered like an open wound. His father's killers, though identified, had evaded punishment due to legal technicalities and intimidation of witnesses. The same rage that had propelled him through years of service now simmered beneath the surface, threatening to consume him. One evening, as Ethan flipped through an old album, he stumbled upon a photograph of Jack in his police uniform, standing beside his patrol car. His father's signature smile, the one that radiated strength and compassion, stared back at him. Ethan ran his fingers over the photo and whispered, "I'm still trying, Dad." Seattle's drizzling rain tapped against the window, a soothing yet melancholic rhythm. Outside, The city's neon lights glowed faintly against the dark sky. Ethan leaned back in his chair, gripping a whiskey glass. Life had thrown him into a purgatory of memories and unresolved anger, but somewhere deep within, the spark of the boy who had once vowed to protect the innocent still flickered. That spark was about to be ignited. The cool drizzle typical of Seattle in autumn cast a subdued atmosphere as Ethan Blake parked his motorcycle outside the bustling train station. His Uncle Charles sat beside him, an unlit cigar clenched between his teeth, his eyes twinkling with excitement. "You know, Ethan," Charles said, his voice carrying a familiar warmth, "it's been ages since I last saw Harold. This trip will be good for my soul." Ethan smiled faintly, shifting his focus to the station entrance. Despite the years spent under Charles's roof, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was always teetering between purpose and chaos. "Just don't gamble away your savings," Ethan teased, a rare flicker of humor escaping his otherwise stoic demeanor. Charles chuckled, slapping Ethan's shoulder. "Don't worry, kid. I'm not that foolish. But you need something to shake things up. Life's been a bit too quiet for you lately, hasn't it?" Before Ethan could respond, his sharp instincts honed by years in combat took hold. His eyes narrowed as a group of bikers entered the station. They moved with a swaggering arrogance, their black leather jackets emblazoned with the emblem of inverted crosses and flaming skulls. Ethan's body tensed. Though their faces were unfamiliar, their demeanor screamed trouble. The group loitered near the platform, their loud voices and crude laughter breaking the station's otherwise peaceful ambience. Ethan's mind churned, his pulse quickening. Memories of his father's murder by a similar gang flickered in his mind like a film reel he couldn't stop. He glanced at Charles, who was too engrossed in reminiscing aloud about Harold to notice the growing tension. "I'll wait for you outside," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. Charles waved him off with a casual, "Suit yourself," before walking toward the platform. Ethan stepped into the parking lot, his boots splashing against puddles as the rain picked up. He leaned against his motorcycle, his eyes darting to the station's glass windows. The bikers hadn't left. Instead, they'd surrounded Charles. Ethan's breath hitched as he saw one of them shove his uncle onto a bench. Another delivered a sharp punch to Charles's abdomen, making the older man double over. A primal fury surged through Ethan. His hand instinctively reached for his phone. Dialing the police, he reported the incident in clipped tones, ensuring every detail was accurate. Hanging up, he sprinted back inside, keeping his movements deliberate and inconspicuous. Years of training took over as he melted into the shadows, observing the chaos unfolding. Charles, though battered, stood his ground, his defiance evident despite the gang's jeers. Ethan's fists clenched as one biker grabbed Charles's wallet, rifling through it with a sneer. The leader, a tall man with a shaved head and menacing tattoos crawling up his neck, issued a low, mocking laugh. "Consider this a toll for crossing paths with the Reapers," he snarled. Ethan's patience snapped, but his mind held firm. Acting rashly would only escalate the situation. Instead, he recorded every detail he could: license plates, patches, scars, anything that could later be used to identify them. The wail of approaching sirens sent the gang scattering. The leader barked a sharp command, and they vanished into the crowd, leaving Charles slumped on the bench. Ethan rushed to his uncle, kneeling beside him. "Charles, are you okay?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. Charles managed a weak smile despite the blood trickling from his split lip. "I've had worse," he muttered, wincing as Ethan helped him stand. The police arrived moments later, but their questions were met with limited answers. Charles, ever the optimist, dismissed the attack as a random mugging, while Ethan refrained from revealing his suspicions. That night, back in his modest apartment, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of déjà vu. The image of the Reaper's emblem burned in his mind, a stark reminder of the justice his father never received. Pouring himself a glass of whiskey, he sat at his cluttered desk and powered up his laptop. The investigation began with fervor. Ethan dove into social media and public forums, searching for any mention of the gang. His military contacts provided additional intel, whispering warnings about the Reaper's ruthless leader, Axel "Razor" Carter. Axel was a name that sent shivers through law enforcement circles, a man with a reputation for brutality and a knack for slipping through the cracks of the legal system. As Ethan pieced together the gang's network, his resolve hardened. He mapped out their known hideouts, studied their criminal activities, and scoured for vulnerabilities. The more he learned, the more personal it became. These weren't just thugs, they were the embodiment of everything Ethan had vowed to fight against. The next morning, Ethan visited Charles in the hospital, his expression a mix of determination and guilt. Charles, though still bruised, greeted him with a grin. "You didn't sleep, did you?" Ethan shrugged, avoiding the question. "I need to know if you recognized any of them. Anything you remember could help." Charles's smile faded as he leaned back against the pillow. "Ethan, let the police handle this. You've done enough fighting for one lifetime." But Ethan's silence spoke volumes. Charles sighed, his voice softening. "Just promise me you won't do anything reckless." Ethan nodded, but his heart was already set. That evening, armed with the knowledge he'd gathered, he began formulating a plan. Axel and the Reapers had made their first move, but Ethan would make sure it was their last. As rain tapped against the window pane, Ethan opened a hidden compartment beneath his bed. Inside lay a collection of tools from his military days: knives, handcuffs, and a tactical vest. His fingers hovered over them briefly before he clenched his fists and shut the compartment. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about justice. The neon buzz of the roadside bar's flickering sign cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt. Ethan Blake parked his motorcycle in the shadows, scanning the entrance. Inside, laughter and the clinking of glasses spilled into the night, masking an air of tension Ethan had learned to recognize. He had tracked Tommy "Snake" Rivers, a low-level member of the Reapers, to this exact location after hours of surveillance and digging through social media breadcrumbs. Snake wasn't the leader, but he was a start, a thread Ethan could pull to unravel the gang. Ethan adjusted the brim of his worn cap, pulling it lower over his eyes as he stepped inside. The smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke filled the air. Patrons hunched over the bar, their laughter almost drowning out the screech of an out-of-tune jukebox. In the far corner, Snake sat with two others, his Reaper's jacket unmistakable even in the dim light. Ethan chose a seat at the bar, his back to the wall, every instinct alive and alert. He ordered a drink, letting his eyes casually wander while his ears focused on their conversation. Snake's voice carried a brash arrogance as he regaled his companions with exaggerated stories of fights and close calls. Ethan's fist tightened around his glass. This man was proud of his violence, of the fear he spread. The hours crawled by, and one by one, Snake's companions drifted out, leaving him alone with his drink. Ethan paid his tab and slipped outside, positioning himself in the shadows of the alley. The rain had started again, soft and persistent, masking his movements. Moments later, Snake stumbled out, his steps unsteady as he lit a cigarette. Ethan followed him down the alley, waiting until the noise of the bar faded. Then, in one swift motion, he grabbed Snake and slammed him against the wall, pinning him by the throat. Snake's eyes widened in shock, his cigarette falling to the wet ground. "Who the hell?" Snake sputtered, but Ethan silenced him with a cold glare. "I'm the one asking questions," Ethan growled. "And you're going to answer every single one of them." Snake struggled, his hands clawing at Ethan's iron grip, but the years of military conditioning gave Ethan the upper hand. He threw Snake to the ground, stepping on his chest before crouching down to meet his panicked eyes. "Where's Axel?" Ethan's voice was calm, almost unnervingly so. "Where do you meet? What's your next move?" Snake's face twisted in defiance, though his fear was palpable. "You think I'm scared of you? You're dead, man. Axel will." Ethan cut him off, pressing harder with his boot. "Axel's not here. You are. Start talking." Minutes ticked by, the rain soaking them both as Ethan systematically dismantled Snake's bravado. A mixture of pain and psychological pressure wore the man down until he finally broke. "There's a warehouse," Snake gasped, his voice trembling. "Down by the docks. That's where Axel's been staying." Satisfied, Ethan eased his grip. Snake, thinking he'd been spared, tried to crawl away, but Ethan wasn't finished. "One more thing," Ethan said, his voice low and lethal. "If I find out you lied to me, I'll be back. And next time, you won't walk away." Snake nodded frantically, scrambling to his feet and disappearing into the rain-soaked night. Ethan exhaled deeply, the adrenaline coursing through him as he watched Snake vanish. His mission was far from over. This was only the first step. The warehouse wasn't hard to find. Ethan parked his motorcycle at a distance and approached on foot, his senses heightened. The area was a maze of abandoned shipping containers and rusted machinery, the kind of place no one would hear a gunshot. Through his binoculars, he observed the building for hours, noting the guards' rotations and the layout of the entrances. The Reapers weren't careless. They had fortified the place, but not enough to deter someone like Ethan. He decided on his approach: strike fast and isolate one of the guards for interrogation. As the night deepened, he moved silently through the shadows, his footsteps masked by the rain. A lone sentry stood near the back entrance, his cigarette glowing faintly in the dark. Ethan crept closer, his movements a blend of precision and patience. With one quick motion, he grabbed the guard from behind, covering his mouth and dragging him into the shadows. The interrogation was brief and brutal. Ethan didn't enjoy this part. It wasn't about cruelty, but efficiency. The guard confirmed Snake's intel. Axel was inside, along with several of his top men. They were planning a shipment of illegal weapons, a deal that could expand their reign of terror across the region. Ethan incapacitated the guard and secured him with zip ties before moving closer to the warehouse. His heart pounded as he prepared to breach the building. Every step forward was a step closer to the man who symbolized everything Ethan had been fighting against since he was a boy. Axel Carter wasn't just a gang leader. He was the face of the chaos that had robbed Ethan of his father and countless others of their peace. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with the smell of oil and sweat. Axel's voice boomed as he barked orders to his men, his presence dominating the room. Ethan crouched behind a stack of crates, his sharp eyes assessing the scene. There were too many to confront head-on, even for him. He needed to pick them off methodically. One by one, Ethan moved through the shadows, using the environment to his advantage. A well-placed distraction here, a silent takedown there, each move brought him closer to Axel. But the closer he got, the more dangerous it became. One of the gang members spotted him, shouting a warning. Chaos erupted. Ethan darted between cover as gunfire lit up the darkened warehouse. His military training kicked in, his movements swift and calculated. He took out 2 more men before a blow to his ribs knocked him off balance. He turned to see Axel, a savage grin on his face as he swung a heavy pipe. The fight was brutal, a clash of strength and skill. Axel was no stranger to combat, and his raw power matched Ethan's precision. Blows landed hard, and the air was filled with the sound of grunts and the clash of metal against flesh. Ethan's focus narrowed, his world reduced to the singular goal of taking Axel down. Finally, using a combination of agility and strategy, Ethan managed to disarm Axel, pinning him against the wall. Blood dripped from both men, their breaths ragged. Axel's defiance hadn't waned. "You're just like me," he spat. "You think you're better, but you're just another killer." Ethan's grip tightened, his mind flashing back to his father's words, "Justice, not vengeance." He stepped back, handcuffing Axel instead of delivering the final blow. The police sirens grew louder in the distance, a sound Ethan had called for before the confrontation began. As the authorities stormed the warehouse, Ethan slipped away into the night, his mission far from over. Axel was in custody, but the battle against the Reapers had only begun. The cold metallic taste of rain filled the air as Ethan Blake crouched atop a ridge overlooking the industrial wasteland. The old oil refinery loomed ahead, its decayed smokestacks piercing the overcast sky like skeletal fingers. This was the Reaper's stronghold, a labyrinth of rusted pipes, darkened corridors, and crumbling platforms. Axel Carter's gang had regrouped here, reinforced by allies Ethan hadn't yet identified. The operation demanded precision. Ethan spent hours surveying the site from his concealed vantage point. His military instincts kicked in as he sketched out every visible patrol route, noting guard shifts and the weak points in their perimeter. The Reapers had fortified the refinery, but their confidence bred complacency. Ethan could exploit that. His preparation began with the environment itself. Using old schematics of the refinery he'd downloaded, Ethan identified areas perfect for traps. He scavenged nearby junkyards for supplies, crafting makeshift tripwires, smoke bombs, and diversionary devices. As the night deepened, he worked under the cover of darkness, setting up his battlefield. Every wire stretched across an entrance, every barrel rigged with improvised explosives, and every corridor laced with diversions was part of his calculated plan. Ethan's thoughts drifted as he worked, the weight of his mission pressing against his resolve. Axel was still in custody, but Ethan had learned that Axel's second-in-command, Blade Mercer, had taken charge. Blade was a man known for his brutality, a fitting heir to Axel's reign of terror. If Blade succeeded in consolidating power, the Reapers' operations would only escalate. Ethan couldn't let that happen. By midnight, the traps were set, and Ethan retreated to a concealed position near the refinery's main entrance. Rain pattered softly against his hood, masking the sound of his breathing. From the shadows, he watched as motorcycles roared into the compound, their headlights cutting through the gloom. Blade Mercer stepped off the lead bike, his towering frame and scarred face illuminated briefly by the glow of the refinery's floodlights. He barked orders to his men, his voice cutting through the night like a whip. Ethan's muscles coiled, every fiber of his being ready for what was to come. He allowed the Reapers to settle in, waiting until their defenses lowered with the false comfort of home turf. Then, with calculated precision, he triggered his first trap. The explosion was small but loud enough to rattle the compound. A barrel rigged with a pressure trigger detonated near the southern gate, sending shrapnel harmlessly into the air but creating chaos among the guards. Ethan used the diversion to slip through an unguarded side entrance, his movements silent and deliberate. Inside the refinery, the air was thick with the stench of oil and rust. The shadows played tricks, the creaks and groans of the old structure amplifying the tension. Ethan moved like a phantom, taking out isolated guards one by one. Each takedown was swift and silent, a knife slicing through darkness, a chokehold ending in unconsciousness. The deeper he infiltrated, the more dangerous it became. The Reapers were no strangers to violence, and their survival instincts began to kick in. Ethan's traps bought him time, each explosion or smoke cloud disorienting the gang and drawing them away from his path. The refinery became a maze of confusion, with Ethan as its ghostly architect. Blade Mercer, however, was no fool. As the chaos spread, he rallied his men, turning their fear into rage. "Find him!" Blade roared, his voice echoing through the refinery. "He's not leaving here alive." Ethan knew his window was closing. He needed to draw Blade out and finish this. Using the refinery's decaying infrastructure to his advantage, he set his final stage. He lured Blade's men into a narrow corridor by planting false trails, footprints in oil, discarded ammunition casings. When they were in position, he triggered a smoke bomb, plunging the corridor into a choking haze. The gang members coughed and stumbled, their weapons firing blindly into the fog. Ethan struck from the shadows, incapacitating them with ruthless efficiency. Blade, hearing the commotion, charged toward the corridor with a group of reinforcements. Ethan watched from above, perched on a rusted catwalk, as his enemy walked straight into the trap. A tripwire snapped, releasing a cascade of oil barrels that crashed into Blade's group, scattering them and knocking several unconscious. But Blade remained standing, his eyes blazing with fury as he scanned the catwalks. "Blake," he bellowed, "I know you're up there. Come down and face me like a man." Ethan stepped forward, his silhouette barely visible against the dim light. "You talk big for someone hiding behind an army," he called back, his voice cold and steady. Blade's lips curled into a snarl. "You think you're better than us? You're just another killer, Blake. Just like me." Ethan descended the metal stairs, his every step deliberate. The remaining gang members backed away, forming a loose circle around the two men. Blade cracked his knuckles, his imposing figure dwarfing Ethan's lean frame. But size didn't intimidate Ethan. He'd faced far worse in the heat of battle. The fight that followed was brutal and raw, a clash of strength versus precision. Blade swung with wild power, his fists crashing into walls and pipes as Ethan evaded him with practiced agility. Ethan's strikes were calculated, targeting joints and weak points, wearing Blade down with each blow. The gang watched in stunned silence, their morale unraveling as their leader faltered. Blade landed a heavy punch to Ethan's ribs, sending him staggering against a support beam. Seizing the moment, Blade grabbed a length of chain and swung it with deadly intent. Ethan ducked just in time, the chain smashing into the beam with a deafening clang. Using the opening, Ethan countered with a vicious elbow strike to Blade's temple, followed by a knee to his gut. Blade fell to his knees, gasping for breath. Ethan stood over him, his chest heaving, his knuckles bloodied. The gang began to scatter, their loyalty evaporating in the face of Blade's defeat. Ethan grabbed Blade by the collar, his voice low and dangerous. "This ends here. No more running. No more terror." Blade spat blood, his defiance unbroken. "You think this changes anything? There's always someone else." Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he secured Blade with zip ties and dragged him to the refinery's entrance. The distant wail of police sirens grew louder, a sound Ethan had orchestrated before the assault began. As the authorities stormed the compound, Ethan slipped into the shadows, his mission complete. But as he rode away into the rain-soaked night, he knew the battle wasn't truly over. The Reapers might be leaderless, but their network remained. And Ethan Blake wouldn't stop until the last thread of their influence was unraveled. The morning light crept into the hospital room, casting a warm glow over Charles's weary face. He sat upright in the bed, his injuries healing but his spirit unwavering. Ethan sat beside him, silent, his eyes locked on a cup of untouched coffee in his hands. The events of the refinery still weighed heavily on his mind, the echoes of Blade Mercer's words ringing in his ears. "There's always someone else." "You look like you've been through hell," Charles said, breaking the silence. His voice was raspy but tinged with humor. "And don't try to tell me it's just lack of sleep. I know that look." Ethan managed a faint smile but couldn't muster a response. He felt the need to share everything, the plans he had made, the lines he had crossed, but the words wouldn't come. Charles leaned forward, his expression softening. "Ethan, whatever it is, you can talk to me. You've been carrying too much for too long." After a long pause, Ethan finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "I did what had to be done, Charles. I stopped them. But I'm starting to wonder if I've become the thing I've been fighting against." Charles studied his nephew for a moment before nodding thoughtfully. "Justice and revenge aren't easy to separate. But the fact that you're asking yourself that question, it means you haven't lost your way." Ethan exhaled deeply, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. The conversation lingered in his mind as he left the hospital and walked through the bustling streets of Seattle. The city felt different, less chaotic, as though some of its tension had been lifted. Yet, Ethan knew the fight wasn't over. The Reaper's collapse had left a void, and voids had a way of attracting darkness. Back at his apartment, Ethan stared at a corkboard pinned with maps, photographs, and notes from his investigation. Axel Carter was still in custody, awaiting trial. Blade Mercer and the Core Reapers were either arrested or scattered. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the gang's roots ran deeper. If there was one lesson he'd learned in his years of service, it was that cutting off the head didn't always kill the beast. His phone buzzed on the desk, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Sarah Connors, the detective who had led the police response at the refinery. Over the past weeks, she had become an unexpected ally, her sharp instincts and determination matching Ethan's own. "I've got good news and bad news," Sarah said when he picked up. Her voice was brisk but carried a note of concern. "The good news is Axel's facing multiple charges. With what we've got on him, he's not walking free anytime soon." "And the bad news?" Ethan asked, though he already had a sense of what was coming. "There's chatter about a splinter group forming," Sarah replied. "Some of the younger members are banding together. They're calling themselves the Revenants. Same symbols, same methods, but they're angrier and sloppier. Ethan closed his eyes, the weight of the news sinking in. Do you have a lead? Sarah hesitated. Nothing concrete. But we intercepted some messages pointing to a rally point in the outskirts. It's risky, but I could use someone with your skill set. Ethan's response was immediate. Send me the details. The rally point was an abandoned motel on the edge of the city. As night fell, Ethan and Sarah met in a secluded parking lot nearby. She handed him a file with all the intel they had, her expression a mixture of determination and unease. We're not sanctioned for this, she warned. If this goes sideways, we're on our own. I've been on my own before, Ethan replied. Let's move. The motel was a decrepit shell of its former self, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. From their vantage point, they observed several figures moving in and out, their movements erratic. Sarah pointed out a makeshift barricade at the entrance and a lookout on the roof. They're expecting trouble, Sarah noted. But they're not expecting us. Ethan nodded, formulating a plan. He handed Sarah a small communication device and outlined their approach. She would cover the perimeter while he infiltrated the building, isolating key targets and gathering intel. It was a dangerous strategy, but it was their best option. Ethan moved like a shadow, slipping past the barricade and scaling the motel's crumbling exterior. The lookout on the roof never saw him coming. A quick chokehold rendered the man unconscious, and Ethan dragged him out of sight before descending into the building. Inside, the air was heavy with the stench of mildew and sweat. The revenants had turned the motel into a crude base, their equipment scattered haphazardly. Ethan crept through the dimly lit hallways, listening to snippets of conversation. The gang was disorganized but volatile, their frustration over the Reaper's downfall fueling their recklessness. Ethan's first objective was a small office near the center of the building, where their leader, a wiry man with a cruel sneer, was holding court. From his hiding spot, Ethan observed the man barking orders, his authority tenuous but effective. The gang was planning something big, though the specifics were unclear. Before Ethan could gather more intel, one of the gang members spotted him. A shout rang out, and chaos erupted. Ethan moved swiftly, neutralizing the immediate threat before retreating into the shadows. The motel became a battlefield, its narrow corridors echoing with gunfire and shouts. Sarah, hearing the commotion, sprang into action. From her position outside, she provided cover, her sharpshooting skills proving invaluable. Together, they began to dismantle the Revenant's operation, their teamwork seamless despite the chaos. Ethan eventually confronted the leader in the motel's dilapidated ballroom. The fight was brutal, the man's desperation making him a dangerous opponent. But Ethan's experience and discipline prevailed. He pinned the leader to the ground, his voice low and commanding. "This is over. Tell your people to stand down." The leader spat at him, his defiance unbroken. "You think you've won? You're just delaying the inevitable." Ethan didn't flinch. "Maybe. But you won't be around to see it." With Sarah's help, they secured the building, incapacitating the remaining gang members. By the time the authorities arrived, the Revenants were neutralized, their plans disrupted. As the adrenaline faded, Ethan and Sarah stood outside the motel, the flashing lights of police cars illuminating the night. "You did good in there," Sarah said, her tone both appreciative and impressed. Ethan nodded, though his expression remained somber. "This isn't the end." "No," Sarah agreed. "But it's a start." Ethan watched as the gang members were loaded into police vans, his mind already turning to what lay ahead. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't fighting alone. The morning sun rose over the quiet neighborhood where Ethan Blake now lived. Its warm rays filtered through the open garage door, illuminating a scene of steady labor and newfound purpose. Ethan, dressed in a grease-streaked t-shirt, worked on the engine of an old motorcycle. Beside him stood a young boy, maybe 16, holding a wrench with trembling hands as Ethan guided him. "Not too much pressure," Ethan said, his voice calm and instructive. "You'll strip the bolt." The boy nodded, his nervousness giving way to concentration as he followed Ethan's instructions. Charles, now fully recovered and as lively as ever, watched from a nearby chair, sipping coffee. "Looks like you've got a knack for teaching," Charles said with a grin. Ethan smiled faintly, stepping back to let the boy finish. Around the garage, a handful of other teenagers worked on different bikes, each immersed in their tasks. What had started as a small project to occupy Ethan's time had grown into something larger, a refuge for at-risk youth in the community. The garage had become a place where they could learn skills, find camaraderie, and escape the harsh realities many of them faced. "All right, let's take a break," Ethan announced, wiping his hands on a rag. The kids dispersed, some heading for the snacks Charles had laid out, others simply sitting back to admire their work. Ethan watched them with a quiet sense of fulfillment. He'd spent so long fighting battles in the shadows, but here, in this small corner of the world, he was building something tangible. Later that evening, Ethan sat on the porch of his modest home, the aroma of grilled food wafting from the backyard where Charles was manning the barbecue. Laughter and chatter filled the air as neighbors and friends gathered for an informal dinner. Among them was Sarah Connors, who had become a constant presence in Ethan's life since their work against the revenants. She joined him on the porch, holding 2 glasses of iced tea. "You've got quite the setup here," she said, handing him a glass. "I'm impressed." "It's not much," Ethan replied, his tone modest. "But it's something." Sarah studied him for a moment before speaking again. "You know, what you're doing with those kids, it matters. More than you realize." Ethan glanced toward the garage, where a couple of the teens were still tinkering with a bike. "They deserve a shot at something better. A chance I didn't think I'd have for a while." "Looks like you're making the most of it," Sarah said, her voice warm. There was an ease between them now, a connection forged not just through shared danger but through mutual respect and understanding. As night fell, Ethan and Sarah took a walk through the neighborhood, the quiet streets lit by the soft glow of streetlights. Their conversation turned to lighter topics, favorite movies, childhood memories, but there was an unspoken acknowledgement of the weight they both carried. When they returned, Charles was handing out plates of food, his booming laughter filling the yard. "Ethan, you need to eat," Charles called, waving a plate in his direction. "You're too skinny to be a hero." Ethan chuckled, joining the group. For a moment, he allowed himself to simply be present, to soak in the laughter and warmth that had been absent from his life for so long. The next day, Ethan visited the police station, where Axel Carter was being held pending his trial. He hadn't planned to see the man again, but a sense of unfinished business lingered. As he entered the holding area, Axel was seated behind a thick pane of glass, his hands cuffed and his expression cold. "Well, if it isn't the golden boy," Axel sneered, leaning back in his chair. "Come to gloat." Ethan remained standing, his posture composed but firm. "I came to make something clear," he said evenly. "Your reign of terror is over. You'll rot here, and the world will move on without you." Axel's grin widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You think you've won? There's always someone else to take my place. You can't change the system, Blake. It's broken, just like you." Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "Maybe I can't fix the system," he said, "but I can stop people like you from breaking anyone else. And that's enough for me." He turned and left without another word, leaving Axel to stew in his confinement. As he walked out of the station, a sense of closure settled over him. The fight wasn't over, not for the world, and not for him, but it was a fight he was finally ready to face. Months passed, and the small garage flourished. Ethan expanded the operation, with Charles helping manage the day-to-day tasks. Local businesses began donating supplies, and word spread about the program. Kids who had once felt invisible found a place where they mattered. Ethan became a mentor, not just in mechanics but in life, teaching resilience, discipline, and hope. One evening, as the garage buzzed with activity, Sarah arrived carrying a box of tools. "Thought you might need these," she said, setting the box down. "Don't say I never bring gifts." Ethan smirked. "You've done more than enough, Sarah." She shrugged. "Just trying to keep up with you." Their partnership had grown into something more, a bond that went beyond shared missions. Sarah became a regular fixture at the garage, offering guidance and support to the kids alongside Ethan. Together, they found a balance, their lives intertwining in ways neither had expected. On a crisp autumn morning, Ethan stood outside the garage, watching as one of the teens took a newly restored motorcycle for a test ride. Charles joined him, a satisfied grin on his face. "You've done good, kid," Charles said, clapping Ethan on the shoulder. "Your dad would be proud." Ethan nodded, his gaze distant but peaceful. "I hope so." As the motorcycle roared down the street, Ethan felt a sense of completeness he hadn't known in years. He wasn't just a soldier or a vigilante anymore. He was a builder, a guide, and perhaps even a friend. The world was still full of challenges, but for the first time, Ethan felt ready to face them, not as a lone warrior, but as part of a community. The day ended with Ethan and Sarah riding their motorcycles along a winding country road, the sunset painting the sky in vibrant hues. The wind rushed past them, carrying with it the promise of a new beginning. For Ethan Blake, the path ahead was no longer shrouded in darkness. It was open, illuminated by the lives he had touched and the purpose he had found. If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.